Emma Lawson was a young, independent, hardworking, and ambitious woman. She worked at a small interior design firm where she took great pride in the projects she contributed to. With her meticulous, creative, and skillful designs, Emma was recognized as one of the promising talents in the company. Her life was simple yet peaceful. Every morning, she woke up feeling content with her job and the close friendships she had built with her colleagues. Though she wasn't wealthy, Emma always felt that she had everything a young woman needed to be happy. However, that was the story of an Emma living in a serene world, until a phone call from her beloved father changed everything. Sitting in her usual cafe, the place she often visited to find creative inspiration, Emma received a call from her father. She picked up the phone only to hear an unfamiliar voice, not the warm, familiar tone she was used to. A strange sense of unease crept into her heart. "Sweetheart, something has happened. I need you to do something important, something difficult." Emma froze, her mind swirling with unanswered questions. Why was her father speaking like this? She could hear the worry in his voice, and a tension was gradually building up. "I don't understand, Dad. What's going on?" Emma asked, her hands trembling slightly with anticipation. "I signed a contract with a major company. It was my mistake. I didn't fully grasp the consequences. But to resolve this issue, you need to marry someone. A man you've never met. This is the only way to save the company." Her father's words hit her like a powerful blow, sending her mind into turmoil before she could even process it. His words exploded in her head like a bomb. "Marry a stranger? What?" Emma's mouth fell open in disbelief. "Dad, I can't do that," she cried out, her voice breaking in panic. "I can't do this. I can't marry someone I've never met just because our company is in trouble." The words spilled out of Emma's mouth instinctively, but deep down, she knew this wasn't the time to resist. She couldn't refuse. Her family's company was on the brink of bankruptcy, and if she didn't comply, they would lose everything. It felt like being trapped in a suffocating cage, unable to break free no matter how much she wanted to. "I understand," Emma whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She had no other choice. She had to do this. Otherwise, her family would fall into ruin. But Emma couldn't help the sinking feeling in her heart. She couldn't imagine what her future would be like, marrying a stranger, especially when he could be someone completely incompatible with her, someone she knew nothing about. Her mind spiraled with uncertainty. She thought about having to live with this man, someone she felt nothing for except reluctance. "Dad, I don't want to do this," Emma murmured, but her father immediately cut her off. "Sweetheart, this is the only way to save our family. You must do it." His voice was firm, unwavering. "Everything can only be salvaged if you go through with this." A sense of helplessness overwhelmed Emma. She didn't know what to do, didn't know what to think. She had always prided herself on her independence and her ability to make decisions for herself. But this time, the only choice wasn't hers to make. Emma gazed out the window, watching the bustling streets where people hurried through their lives, while her mind was trapped in stillness. She no longer had a choice. There was only one path ahead, one shrouded in uncertainty, leading to an unknown destination. Welcome to Soul Stories, Puker. Life can be overwhelming, but here, we share heartfelt tales to bring you peace, joy, and inspiration. Your support, every comment, like, and follow means the world to us. It motivates us to create more meaningful and uplifting stories just for you. Subscribe now and be part of a community that spreads love, kindness, and positivity. Let's make every day a little brighter together. Emma stepped into Tom Reed's office, her heart weighed down by anxiety and doubt. She sighed as she entered the luxurious yet cold space of his workplace. The long, meticulously arranged desks, the sunlight streaming through the large glass windows. None of it could dispel the tense atmosphere that enveloped her. Beyond the windows, the city stretched out in full view from the towering skyscraper. But inside this room, everything felt shrouded in an icy stillness. Tom sat behind his desk, his tall, commanding presence akin to that of a king ruling over his domain. Dressed in a sharp black suit, his neatly combed hair and razor-sharp gaze remained fixed on his work. He didn't even look up when Emma entered. His expression was impassive, void of any emotion. Whoever she was, it didn't matter. He was a man unmoved by external forces. Emma took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but her mind continued to spin. She still couldn't believe this was happening. Her peaceful life, her beloved career. Everything was crumbling because of a marriage she had never wanted. This marriage was not born out of love or choice, but was merely a desperate solution to her family's financial troubles. She stepped forward, her movements firm with determination, stopping right in front of his desk. She met his gaze head-on. "I want to cancel this marriage," Emma declared, her voice resolute but laced with anxiety. "This is a mistake. I never agreed to this." Tom remained unmoved, not a flicker of reaction crossing his face. He lifted his glass of whiskey, took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving the swirling liquid as he processed his own thoughts. Only after setting the glass back down did he finally look at her. His gaze held no emotion, only an eerie calm, as if nothing in life could ever truly affect him. "Then prove it," he said, a smirk curling at his lips. His voice was cold, but there was an unmistakable challenge in his tone. "Live with me for 1 month. If after that you still want to leave, I'll let you go." His words struck Emma like a thunderclap. 1 month? She couldn't imagine spending an entire month living with this cold, distant man. But she had no choice. If this was the only way to escape this marriage, she had to take it. Emma stared into his eyes, her expression filled with both determination and skepticism. She didn't trust that he would let her go so easily, but she also couldn't refuse what seemed to be her only option. 1 month. She would have to endure living with him for a month while the question gnawed at her. Could she truly change anything? "I can't do this," she said, but her voice lacked the conviction it had before. "Anything could happen, but living with you?" Tom's expression remained unchanged. He stood up, moving around his desk, closing the space between them. His gaze remained sharp, unwavering like steel. "Do you think you can change my mind?" he asked, his tone calm yet resolute. 1 month, that's all." A suffocating feeling settled over Emma. 1 month, just 1 month living with him. Would this be a test she couldn't endure? She had tried to refuse, but the truth was, her life was no longer her own. This decision wasn't hers to make. Life had made it for her. 1 month? "I'll stay," she whispered, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. The days leading up to the wedding passed quickly, filled with an unavoidable sense of cold detachment. Emma had no choice but to comply with her father's demands. And though she had no desire for this marriage, she couldn't refuse. Her family's company was in crisis. And if she didn't go through with this, they would lose everything. Everything was prepared hastily, devoid of any love or romance. She had no say in choosing her wedding dress, no joy in trying on elegant gowns. Every detail was handled by Tom's representatives, and all Emma had to do was show up at the appointed time. She was taken to an expensive bridal boutique, where pristine white dresses sparkled under the showroom lights. Each time she tried on a new dress, she felt like she was putting on a costume for a role that didn't belong to her. Tom's assistants, with their stern expressions, meticulously scrutinized every detail as if they were preparing for an important event. And Emma was merely a piece in their carefully curated story. "So, which one will you choose?" one of the assistants asked as she stood before the mirror, feeling like a shadow trapped inside an unfamiliar gown. Emma looked at her reflection, draped in a flawless white wedding dress, but she didn't see a bride. She saw a tired, sorrowful girl being forced into a role she never wanted. Her eyes reflected nothing but disappointment, yet there was nothing she could do to change her fate. The wedding day arrived too quickly, leaving her no time to prepare herself mentally. Everything unfolded like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. She didn't want to see him, didn't want to think about becoming the wife of a complete stranger. She wanted to run away, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized there was no escape. As the ceremony began, the venue was grand and elegant, yet it lacked the warmth and joy she had always imagined for this day. Chandeliers sparkled from above, roses were arranged in intricate patterns, and a live orchestra played a soft melody, enhancing the luxurious atmosphere. But Emma felt like a ghost drifting through the gathering of well-dressed guests. As she walked down the aisle, all eyes were on her, but she only felt lost. She found no warmth in the gaze of her soon-to-be husband. All she saw was a cold, unreadable stare, as if he was indifferent to everything happening around him. He simply stood there, expressionless, unsmiling, his icy gaze fixed on her. As she drew closer, each step felt heavier, as though she was walking on a path of sharp stones. Her heart clenched with every moment. This wasn't her wedding. It was an arrangement made by others, a decision she had no power to refuse. "Do you, Emma Lawson, take Tom Reed to be your husband?" The officiant's voice echoed through the hall, but Emma couldn't answer immediately. She stood frozen, her hands clenched into fists, trying to suppress the turmoil within her. "I do." The words finally escaped her lips, cold and mechanical, as if uttered out of reflex. Tom's gaze remained on her, unwavering, yet devoid of emotion. He simply nodded, as though he was carrying out a scripted obligation. As the vows were exchanged, Emma couldn't shake the suffocating feeling in her chest. The entire wedding felt devoid of life, of love. Everything was a formality, a ritual. She was merely an outsider watching it all unfold. Doubt and fear churned in her mind. Is this really the fate I deserve? When they exchanged rings, Emma felt nothing but emptiness. She glanced at the ring on her finger, then at Tom's eyes. They remained unchanged, distant, unaffected, completely devoid of affection. She knew she wasn't the woman he loved, just as he wasn't the man she had chosen. They were nothing more than two strangers, forced into marriage for reasons neither of them could change. As the ceremony ended, Emma found herself standing alone among the many guests on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. But there was no happiness, only the overwhelming sensation of being a puppet, pulled along by the strings of fate. Married life between Emma and Tom began with exhausting, challenging days. A marriage without love, without desire, merely an arrangement they were both forced to follow. Emma felt like a puppet in someone else's hands, and living with Tom, a cold, powerful man, only intensified that feeling. From the moment they started living under the same roof, Emma resolved to do everything she could to make Tom miserable, hoping he would eventually call off the marriage. She wanted him to grow tired of everything and be the one to let her go. But things didn't unfold the way she expected. With a mischievous plan in mind, Emma decided to start her married life with small yet extremely annoying pranks. While Tom was preparing for an important business meeting, Emma decided to do something completely natural. She entered the kitchen setting up a plate of toast with strawberry jam, arranging everything to look like she was preparing a perfect breakfast. However, she couldn't stop giggling to herself when she noticed Tom's expensive suit hanging nearby. With careful precision, she accidentally let the jam-covered toast slip onto his white shirt. A brief moment of victory flashed through her as she saw his pristine shirt smeared with bright red jam. "If he wants me here, I'll make sure he regrets it," she thought smugly. When Tom entered the kitchen and put on his jacket, he barely glanced at the stained shirt before letting out a quiet sigh. Emma expected him to explode with anger, but instead, something unexpected happened. He simply said, "Looks like you need to learn how to stay away from the kitchen." "Oh, really? But isn't it a privilege to have an expert around?" Emma teased, her tone playful. Tom only let out a small sigh before walking out of the kitchen, returning moments later in a different shirt. His expression remained cold and unreadable, but there was something different in his demeanor. Without a word, he calmly retrieved ingredients from the fridge and began preparing breakfast. "Sit down, I'll make breakfast for you," he said, his voice steady, with no hint of irritation. Emma stood still for a moment, caught off guard by his reaction, but she said nothing. She took a seat at the table, watching as he worked. His movements were precise and effortless, as if cooking was second nature to him. Not something he had to do, but something he did with a strange sense of patience, despite the mess she had created. A few minutes later, he placed a plate of perfectly cooked eggs, toast with jam, and a glass of fresh orange juice in front of her. The kitchen, which had looked like a disaster zone minutes ago, was now impeccably neat. "What do you think?" Tom asked, his gaze on her, not stern but surprisingly gentle. Emma glanced at the meal, then at him. A part of her felt embarrassed, But another part was unexpectedly moved. Despite her deliberate attempt to create chaos, he had calmly fixed everything and even cared for her. She couldn't deny the warmth in his actions, even if he never spoke a word of affection. "Thank you. I didn't expect you to be so calm," she admitted, her voice softer than before. She picked up a piece of toast and took a bite, tasting the rich strawberry jam. It was a delicious breakfast, and she couldn't ignore the unspoken care he had put into it. Tom merely shrugged, offering a faint smile before sitting across from her. A strange warmth filled the kitchen, and for a moment, Emma was unsettled by how patient he was with her. Unsatisfied with the results of her first attempt, Emma decided to push Tom further. She knew he always woke up early for work, so she planned to wake him up at 4 a.m., but in a very special way, blasting loud disco music. She carefully set her alarm and turned the speakers to full volume, filling the house with thumping bass and electrifying beats. The moment the music blared through the walls, she felt a rush of victory, but her excitement was short-lived when she heard movement. Moments later, Tom stepped into the room, his face half-shadowed by the dim hallway light, his expression unreadable. Emma braced herself, expecting him to lash out in frustration, but instead he simply raised an eyebrow and asked in a calm, slightly amused tone, "Emma can't sleep. I just thought you weren't quite ready to start your day without a little energy boost." Emma smirked, her eyes gleaming with mischief, as if this was just an innocent joke. She expected him to be angry, to yell at her for being ridiculous. But no. Tom simply walked over, turned off the music, and turned back to her, his gaze steady. "Then from now on, you'll be responsible for my mornings," he said smoothly, his voice carrying an unexpected hint of humor. Emma stood there, caught off guard. She had anticipated irritation, but not this. Not amusement. He wasn't angry. He was playing along. His patience, his calm demeanor, it was completely unexpected. The feeling of victory she had at the beginning started to fade. Her prank hadn't brought her the satisfaction she had hoped for. Instead, it left her questioning herself. Did she really want to keep testing him? A part of her still wanted to push further, to see if she could finally break through his composure, force him to give up on this marriage. But Tom had an answer for every one of her tricks. His responses, gentle yet firm, only deepened the strange, unsettling emotions building inside her. Unable to stop herself, Emma continued her efforts to make their marriage as exhausting as possible. This time, she decided to push the limits even further. The formal dinner they had to attend was the perfect opportunity for her to express her discontent once again. She knew that high-profile events where Tom appeared always drew attention, and she wanted to make things as uncomfortable as possible. She chose the most outrageous outfit imaginable, an overly bright, garish dress paired with impossibly high heels. Everything about her look screamed eccentricity, ensuring that she would stand out in the worst possible way. Emma couldn't help but smirk at the thought of being the most eye-catching person in the crowd, but for all the wrong reasons. When she stepped out of the dressing room, she expected Tom to be furious. Yet to her surprise, he merely offered a small, unreadable smile. Not one of approval, but not of outright criticism either. "You're not seriously going like that, are you?" Tom asked, his voice firm, but devoid of anger. "I don't see a problem. At least I won't be the only one drawing attention," Emma replied, her tone dripping with sarcasm as she met his gaze defiantly. As they arrived at the event, Emma immediately felt the weight of every gaze on her. She was undoubtedly the star of the evening, but not in the way she had envisioned. Instead of admiration, she felt the subtle sting of judgment and barely concealed mockery. She had certainly succeeded in capturing attention, but it was not the kind she had anticipated. What shocked her most, however, was Tom's reaction, or rather his lack of one. He did not recoil in embarrassment, nor did he try to distance himself from her. Instead, he remained by her side, unfazed, his presence a silent shield against the unkind whispers. "Emma, you've certainly made this evening more interesting," he remarked lightly, his tone carrying an unexpected warmth. His smile this time was different, not cold or dismissive, but one of quiet understanding. "Thanks, but I don't think I'll be able to entertain you like this forever," Emma said, forcing a smirk. though a flicker of doubt lingered in her eyes. Despite her attempts to be insufferable, she couldn't ignore the quiet patience in Tom's demeanor. Throughout the night, Emma couldn't help but notice the subtle ways Tom looked after her. Even though she was aware of the critical stares and quiet whispers around them, he never once let her feel isolated. He stood close, his mere presence enough to shield her from the judgment of others. He never let her face the ridicule alone. As the evening drew to a close, Emma's feet throbbed in pain from the absurdly high heels she had stubbornly chosen. Descending the staircase, she miscalculated her step, twisting her ankle. Pain shot through her leg with each movement, making it impossible to walk properly. Before she could even brace herself, Tom was already there. Without hesitation, he bent down and lifted her into his arms, carrying her with ease. No complaints, no irritation, just quiet, unspoken care. "Don't worry, I'll take you home," he murmured softly. Emma said nothing, merely letting herself rest in his arms. In that moment, she realized that her pranks hadn't just exhausted her. They had stirred something unexpected within her as well. Tom wasn't just tolerating her antics. He was seeing through them, understanding the things she wasn't saying out loud. Despite all her efforts to make their marriage unbearable, to test his patience, she had never once been met with anger or frustration. He never retaliated, never lashed out. Instead, he remained steady, watching over her in a way she hadn't expected, quietly, protectively. And with each silent act of care, he was beginning to slip past the walls she had so desperately built around herself. There were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when she felt an inexplicable connection between them. She didn't want to acknowledge it, but Tom's unwavering patience and his warm, steady gaze were making it harder and harder to ignore. Perhaps in all the moments he had stayed silent, he had been protecting her, not just physically, but emotionally as well. Emma felt something shift inside her. She had always thought she wanted to escape this marriage, to break free, but now she wasn't so sure. Because deep down, she was beginning to feel something she never thought she would, something she wasn't sure she was ready to admit. Day by day, Emma continued her mischievous antics, hoping to drive Tom to frustration and force him to end the marriage. Yet contrary to her expectations, every time she tried to push him to his limits, he only grew more patient and gentle with her. He never got angry. Instead, he found ways to protect her, to care for her in ways she couldn't understand. It left her feeling unsettled. She had always thought of him as an arrogant, cold man, too absorbed in his work, but his actions were forcing her to reconsider. One evening, after all her pranks had failed to provoke the reaction she had hoped for, Emma decided to do nothing at all. Instead, she simply sat in silence and observed him. As they sat in the living room, sipping tea, the silence between them stretched on. The entire room was bathed in stillness. The only light came from the moon filtering through the window, casting soft, shifting patterns on the floor. Emma gazed out at the night sky, feeling the quiet serenity of the evening, but inside her mind was anything but peaceful. Tom was cold, distant, always composed, always unreadable. And yet, no matter what she did, he never lashed out. Instead, he merely smiled, his patience never wavering. She couldn't understand why he was so gentle with her, why he refused to react with the frustration she had anticipated. Finally, she turned to him, unable to contain her curiosity any longer, and asked in a quiet voice, "Do you never get angry when I pull these ridiculous stunts?" Tom didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the window, as if he were searching for an answer in the darkness beyond. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of his slow, steady breathing. After a long pause, he finally turned to look at her, but this time, his gaze was different. No longer cold, no longer arrogant, just quiet, steady, and something else, something she couldn't quite define. "I don't want to hurt you like others have." His voice was deep, laced with an underlying sadness, restrained yet full of meaning. Pain doesn't just come from anger, it also comes from indifference, from distance. Emma stared at him in shock, her heart tightening at his words. He wasn't scolding her, he wasn't dismissing her. Instead, he had spoken a truth so profound that it left her speechless. She had expected irritation, perhaps even cruelty. But instead, he had given her honesty. And in that honesty, she heard something deeper than anger, something far more painful. Tom shifted slightly, his gaze turning inward, revealing a part of himself he had long kept hidden. He didn't look at her this time. Instead, he stared at a point in the distance, as if trying to keep himself from delving too deep into the past. Then in a voice quieter than before, he spoke again, this time with effort, as if pulling the words from wounds long buried. When I was a child, I watched my mother suffer from cancer until she passed away. I couldn't do anything to save her. And after she was gone, I felt like I had lost everything. My father couldn't help me. He had his business, his endless projects, and nothing else. I grew up alone with no one by my side. I had to learn to be strong, to stand on my own. That's why I built these walls, so that no one could hurt me again. He exhaled a slow breath before adding, I'm afraid that if I love someone, I'll lose them, that I'll have to face that loneliness again. And I don't know if I can survive it a second time. Emma listened in silence, his words settling deep in her heart. They felt like old scars being exposed, wounds reopening. And as she looked into his eyes, she saw it, the grief, the pain he had carried for so long, buried beneath layers of ice. She had never imagined what he had been through, but now she felt as if she understood him in a way she never had before. He didn't say anything else. His eyes remained distant, locked onto memories no one else could reach. Emma couldn't stay still any longer. She didn't want him to face this pain alone, not anymore. Gently, she reached for his arm, resting her head against his shoulder, saying nothing. There was no need for words. In that moment, the silence between them was enough. Their hearts had started to beat in unison. Tom was no longer the cold, unfeeling man she had believed him to be. And she was no longer the wife filled with doubt. The final day of their 1-month agreement arrived, and Emma felt as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her. She stood by the window, staring outside at the dimming lights of the city as twilight cast its hazy glow. Confusion gripped her, her heart torn in two. She had spent the past month in a whirlwind of emotions, sharing moments she never thought she'd have with Tom. She still remembered the first time she walked into this house, so determined to leave. But now, after living with him for a month, she couldn't deny that something had changed. She had seen warmth in his eyes, felt the care he showed her through the smallest gestures. Slowly, the cold exterior she had first seen had unraveled, revealing patience, kindness, and a quiet strength she hadn't expected. But her mind kept telling her that love couldn't grow from a forced marriage, that she couldn't stay in a relationship that had started with no foundation of love. No matter how well he treated her, she couldn't justify staying in a marriage based on obligation rather than choice. And so she made her decision. She stood up, picked up her suitcase, gripping it tightly as if trying to hold on to all the unspoken emotions within her. She had to walk away. She had to close this chapter. As she stepped toward the door, she saw Tom standing in the living room, watching her with unreadable eyes. He didn't move, didn't rush to stop her. He simply stood there, staring at her, as if he had already anticipated this moment. After a long silence, he finally spoke. Did this month mean nothing to you? His voice was low but laced with pain. The question cut through Emma like a blade. She stopped, her hands trembling around the handle of her suitcase. She couldn't answer, not immediately. She turned to look at him, and for the first time his eyes weren't distant. They weren't cold. They were full of something else, something deeper, something more vulnerable than she had ever seen before. He wasn't just asking for an answer. He was asking her to stay. Emma's heart clenched painfully. She knew whatever she said now would change everything. You know, don't you? She whispered, her voice cracking. This past month, I won't deny that it meant something to me, but I can't stay in a marriage without love. I can't lie to myself. Tom didn't argue. He didn't try to convince her. He only stood there, his chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled breath. I know I can't make you stay, he murmured, but I want you to. Don't go. His voice was soft, but his eyes held an unspoken plea. Emma felt her heart shatter at those words. She knew he meant them. She could hear it, the raw, quiet confession in his voice. And it hurt because, deep down, she knew she had started to feel something for him too. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She turned away, looking at her suitcase. Can I really leave without looking back? She wondered. But just as she took a step forward, a strong hand grasped hers, stopping her. She turned back, meeting his gaze. And in that moment, she knew. She couldn't leave. She couldn't walk away from him. And for the first time, tears fell freely down her cheeks. Not out of sadness, but because she had finally accepted the truth. I'll stay, she whispered. I'll give myself a chance to love you. And as she stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him, she knew this was just the beginning of something real, something neither of them had expected, something worth staying for. After spending time living in their newfound love, Emma's mischievous antics gradually became cherished memories between her and Tom. Together, they built a marriage filled with warmth, even if there were still moments of uncertainty. Over time, Tom expressed his love not through grand declarations, but through subtle actions, gestures that spoke louder than words, and Emma found that she no longer felt awkward around him. Her heart, though hesitant to fully admit it, had already begun to change in ways she could no longer deny. However, just as their relationship was blossoming into something truly beautiful, an unexpected shock from the past disrupted everything. One afternoon, Emma received a call from an unknown number. When she answered, a familiar voice sent her heart into turmoil. Emma, it's Ryan. Ryan, the man she had once loved with all her heart, the love of her youth. Memories came flooding back, pulling her into the undertow of the past. He had been her first love, the man she had once believed was her forever. She had been willing to sacrifice everything for him, and now, hearing his voice again, she couldn't deny the emotions that stirred deep within her. I know you never wanted this marriage. Ryan's voice was both persuasive and desperate. Leave him and come back to me. Emma's heart clenched. Just hearing his name sent her mind spinning. Ryan had been her first love, the person she had once thought she would never stop loving. But now, as she listened to his words, she realized something. There was a distance between them, one that hadn't been there before. Ryan had left for his studies abroad and disappeared from her life without warning, leaving her to bear the pain of losing him alone. For years, she had secretly harbored the hope that he would return to her. And now that he had, why did she feel so different? She stared at her phone, torn between the past and the present. Part of her longed for what once was, but another part felt uneasy, guilty even, because of Tom. He was the one who had been by her side, the one who had protected her, loved her without asking for anything in return. He had never pressured her, never demanded her love. He had simply waited, hoping that one day she would choose him as he had already chosen her. Emma stood at a painful crossroads, the past and the present. Ryan and Tom, both had been significant in her life, but now her love had changed. She knew she couldn't live in memories forever, but how could she face the truth of what her heart was telling her? Tom noticed the turmoil in her expression. He didn't question her, didn't demand answers. Instead, he simply looked at her with quiet understanding. Emma, the decision is yours alone. Whatever you choose, I will respect it, Tom said, his voice calm but carrying an underlying sadness. Emma and Tom attended a prestigious gala together. As they entered the grand ballroom, Emma's heart skipped a beat when she saw him. Ryan. He stood near the center of the room, his gaze locked onto her, filled with longing and hope. The room sparkled with chandeliers, the air filled with the sound of laughter and lively conversations. But for Emma, time seemed to slow, the world around her fading away. In that moment, there were only three people, Emma, Ryan, and Tom. Do you still love me? Ryan asked, stepping closer, his voice a plea wrapped in nostalgia. Emma stood frozen, unable to immediately answer. The memories of their love came rushing back. The way he had been her first love, the way he had once meant everything to her. He had been her past, the one she had dreamed of for so long. But why, now that she was standing before him, did he feel like a stranger? She turned her gaze toward Tom. He stood there silent, watching her. Not with judgment, not with expectation, but with the unwavering patience he had always shown her. He wasn't trying to convince her to stay. He wasn't asking her to choose him. He was simply there, waiting for her decision. And in his eyes, Emma saw something undeniable. She couldn't lie to herself any longer. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. Without hesitation, she reached for Tom, stood on her toes and kissed him, right there, in front of everyone. The room went silent for a heartbeat before erupting into applause, as if the world itself was acknowledging the decision that had just been made. Ryan stood motionless, stunned, his eyes filled with disbelief. Meanwhile, Tom smiled. But it wasn't a smug, victorious smile. It was soft, full of warmth and understanding, filled with the love he had always carried for her. This kiss, her first kiss that she had willingly given him, was her answer. He had won. "I win," Tom whispered teasingly in her ear as they left the party. Emma flushed, but she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. A quiet, gentle happiness filled her heart. She chuckled softly. "What do you mean, win?" "I was just testing you," she said playfully, though they both knew the truth. And from that moment on, Emma knew. Love had never been a mistake. The love she and Tom had built against all odds was the most precious thing in her life. Tonight was a gentle evening, the house bathed in the warm glow of candlelight. Tom and Emma sat together on the sofa, her head resting against his shoulder. The atmosphere felt still, as if time itself had paused, wrapping them in a comforting embrace. They didn't need words. Happiness was present in their silence, in the quiet beats of their hearts. Emma gazed out the window, admiring the soft twinkle of the stars scattered across the night sky. A warmth settled in her chest, a feeling of peace she had never quite experienced before. Beside her, Tom sat in deep thought, his expression steady yet contemplative. Sensing the shift in the air, Emma turned toward him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Emma," Tom began, his voice low and soothing, tinged with a hint of hesitation. "There's a story I've wanted to tell you." Emma tilted her head, sensing something important. "What story?" she asked, unaware of what was coming. Tom smiled, but there was a distant look in his eyes, as though he were reaching into a memory long buried. "It's about a boy, a timid boy, one who had lost his mother too soon and grew up in a world filled with loneliness and fear. He was bullied constantly, with no one to stand up for him, until one day, a little girl, smaller than him, stepped in to protect him, and every time they both got beaten up, she never backed down." Emma's brows knitted slightly. She wasn't sure why Tom was telling her this, but something about the story held her in place. "The boy was afraid," Tom continued, his voice softer now. "But when the girl stood in front of him, shielding him despite her own fear, he realized he wasn't alone. And from that moment on, he made a promise to himself. One day he would marry that girl because she was the only one who had ever fought for him." Tom paused, turning to look at her. His gaze was filled with something deep, something tender. And as Emma studied his face, something stirred in her, an odd sense of familiarity, like a memory she couldn't quite grasp. "And that little girl was you," he whispered, his voice carrying a weight she hadn't expected. Emma froze. His words struck her like a bolt of lightning. "Me?" Her mind reeled. That's impossible," she stammered. "I don't remember that." Tom chuckled softly, his eyes searching hers. "But I do. I remember it clearly. I remember standing there, terrified, thinking no one would help me. And then you appeared. You weren't the strongest, nor the biggest, but you were the bravest person I had ever met. From that moment on, I knew I would marry you one day. I loved you from that moment, even if you didn't know it." Emma's breath hitched, her heart pounding. She was speechless. She had no memory of that day, yet as she looked into Tom's eyes, she knew he was telling the truth. Her chest tightened with emotion, overwhelmed by the revelation. "You loved me since then?" she murmured, her voice trembling. "But why? Why didn't you ever tell me?" Tom reached up, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch warm and reassuring. "Because I knew you didn't remember," he admitted, "and I didn't want to burden you with my feelings. But I never forgot. I promised myself that one day when the time was right, I would ask you to stay by my side, no matter how long it took. He paused, his eyes full of raw sincerity. Because you are the only person I have ever wanted to be with. Emma could hardly breathe. Her heart ached, not in pain, but in the overwhelming realization of what he had just confessed. A love so deep, so unwavering, had been right in front of her all along. And though she had not remembered the past, she could feel the truth of his words in every action he had ever shown her. Then Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He lowered himself onto one knee, looking up at her with a mix of love and nervous anticipation. "Emma, will you give me another chance?" His voice was steady, yet his eyes held a vulnerability she had never seen before. "A chance to walk this life with you? To love you the way I've always wanted to?" Emma stared at him, her hands trembling as they clasped his. She could feel his heartbeat through his touch, strong and real, just like his love. She didn't need to think. She didn't need to ask any more questions. "Yes, Tom," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." A brilliant smile spread across